Wagons, ho! The wagon master's voice echoed across the line of 23 wagons. Move 'em out! A bullwhip snapped in the cool air of the early independent spring morning, and the first wagon, driven by Parson McDaniels and his wife, began rolling forward. Jake Holt, in his job as scout, felt his heart speed up. The first morning was always the most fun. A line of folks setting out in search of a better life. He enjoyed helping them. And this was his last journey. The longing he felt for home had grown until he could hardly escort any more settlers across the country. Instead, he wanted to spur his horse and gallop straight for the land he'd homesteaded in Oregon. He'd homesteaded last September during a previous trip when he'd reached Oregon, spending the winter there. But he needed the money, and he'd promised his friend Dakota, the wagon master. A few years back, he'd have had to wait until the mountain trails opened, which could be as late as June. But now, with the trails widened and the train tracks cutting through, he'd headed east in the early spring, rushing across the country on the train to reach Omaha, then south on a paddle wheel boat to Independence, Missouri, in time to ride back west one final time. Dakota Harlan, the wagon master, had plans to team up with Jake and settle down. How many times now had he made this trek? 5? 6? 25 years old, and he'd made this trip across the country many times. Wagon train travel was safer now than it had been when he'd first started doing this. The West was more settled. The trails were better scouted. Of course, there could still be plenty of trouble. Long, hot days, disease sometimes swept through the train, flooding, tornadoes, the occasional interaction with a grizzly or a cougar or a rattlesnake. Avalanches and blocked trails could cause trouble in the mountains. Jake had once survived a buffalo stampede. A small herd, but even a few buffalo could prove deadly. Horses came up lame, wagon wheels broke, children could hurt themselves or fall sick. Jake knew all of that could happen, and much more, because it had happened to him. But even with all that, the trips had gotten safer.